On July 18, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for bankruptcy. Detroit is one of the oldest cities in the Midwest. It was the foundation for most of the American auto industry, which really boomed after World War II. Detroit is nicknamed Motor City or Motown for its major part in the auto industry. The city was built on the GM model. However, too much risk tied up in a single entity is rarely a good thing. Along with the recession of the 80s and the oil crisis of the 70s, GM lost most of their customers to the low-cost, fuel-efficient foreign vehicles. With the many GM factories closing down and many assembly jobs being replaced by machines, Detroit's population has shrunk almost 25% in the last decade. The city's population fall resulted in a smaller tax base. Residents of Detroit pay the highest taxes in the state and receive the lowest services. The Detroit bankruptcy was not a sudden problem, but a few mistakes in the management of the city's investments made bankruptcy inevitable for the city.
Thanks, Taylor. There were many issues that led to the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit. First, began with the decline in the auto industry. Detroit is home to the top automobile industries in the nation, with Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler all located in Detroit. With the decline in the economy, these automakers saw a huge decrease in production and revenue. Major shareholders made devastating decisions with the direction of these companies, failing to keep in competition with Japanese and European automobile industries. General Motors and Ford were able to receive federal bailouts, but unfortunately Detroit did not. Since 2000, unemployment has tripled, peaking at 28% in 2008 and at about 16% today. Crime is at a historic high, with police taking an average of 58 minutes to respond to calls. As Taylor mentioned before, the population in Detroit has dropped drastically, from 1.8 million in 1950 to only 700,000 today. This decrease in population has led to over 78,000 city structures being abandoned. All of these issues have led to a 30% decrease in tax revenue. To top it all off, Detroit has an unfunded pension responsibility totaling $18 billion, or just about $25,000 per family. Needless to say, this has led to many speculations that there is no longer a middle class in Detroit, only the rich and the poor. For more on the bankruptcy in Detroit, here's John.
As you can tell, there's a large problem with Detroit's current financial situation. This begs the question if there are problems elsewhere among other cities. Currently, there's a cash shortfall in Detroit, as stated, of about $162 million and a running deficit of this year alone of $368 million. There are similar problems on a smaller scale around the world as a result of diminished tax revenue as well as increasing labor costs. There have been 4 cities to become insolvent since 2007 alone. These cities include California's Vallejo, Stockton, and San Bernardino, as well as Rhode Island's Central Falls. One critic of Detroit has stated, "Detroit is a very high-profile example of some of the challenges our cities continue to face, but is by no means unique." This was stated by Kill Hugh, an analyst who is responsible for tracking local finances in Detroit. He goes on to say that Detroit is indicative of governments living beyond their means, and they are going to eventually have to pay the piper. This begs the question of ethical issues and ethical management. The ethical issues of the ability to simply file bankruptcy or defaults as a trend to battle monetary distress is concerning due to the fact that it provides a simple way out for the decision makers of large cities who are not forced to endure the consequences of their potentially unethical decision making throughout the years. As you can tell, ethics and management is an important issue at all levels. Thank you. Now on to Brian with potential remedies for Detroit.
Thanks, John. Now that Detroit has filed for bankruptcy, how do officials manage affairs going forward in order to give Detroit the best chance at long-term economic growth? In a recent article with Forbes magazine, John McComber, a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School, stated that one of the first and most important factors in Detroit's recovery will be rebuilding the city's soft infrastructure. This includes creating an environment for capital, investment, and entrepreneurship that encourages businesses to start, locate, or invest in the city. With the mass exodus of investors over the last decade, Detroit needs to make it appealing for business to come back to town. Detroit is also suffering from poor basic infrastructure, especially with water, roads, and bridges. Projects have run well over costs, and repairs are seriously behind. Detroit should take cues from other cities and implement strategic partnerships where the private sector steps in to help build and operate key public infrastructure. This enables lots of things to happen with little initial investment from the city and instills a new, financially motivated management. One of the most other major repairs needed is to the pension and healthcare deficits that are on the city's books. Numbers released this week show that Detroit owes $6.4 billion in other post-employment benefits and primary obligations to pay healthcare premiums for retired public employees. To avoid fiscal disasters like this one, other cities should slow down the growth of their unfunded retiree health liabilities. In order to do this, Detroit will have to work on reducing its current liabilities. According to Robert Posen, one step in doing this is to require benefit holders to transfer to Medicare at age 65. They could also force state employees to receive health care through the new Affordable Health Care Act. Lastly, Benjamin Kennedy, a senior program officer of the Crestage Foundation, states that Detroit can take some cues from other formerly financially devastated cities, like Pittsburgh. This city found itself in a similar mess during the 1980s and managed to bounce back with great leadership and management. Detroit will need some of the same, and with the resilience and commitment of Detroit's people, they too can bounce back. Now on to Frank for the wrap-up.
Thank you, Brian. The announcement of Detroit's filing bankruptcy on July 18th came as shocking news to many Americans. However, some would argue that this unfortunate event has been in the making for some 60 years now, as the economy of Detroit has steadily declined over time. Although the city of Detroit was once the fourth largest municipality in the United States, it now suffers from several different ailments. Most notably, as has already been mentioned, the failure of the U.S. auto industry, which was for years the city's backbone. Also, to worsen matters, many have left the city, depleting its tax base. As Brian mentioned, remedies for Detroit do exist. However, as Detroit is the largest city to have ever filed for bankruptcy, many are unsure as to how exactly the situation should be handled. Clearly, changes must begin with the city's management. Currently, it seems the type of management skills Detroit requires to dig itself out of the hole it is in may not be available. Bankruptcy is a clear cry from Detroit for help from the federal government. If the federal government does step in and manage the city, how severe will the ultimatums placed on Detroit's citizens be? Some believe the nation as a whole should be forced to sacrifice a little in order to lend Detroit a helping hand. Others, though, see this as a problem that the city created for itself by failing to adapt to changing national and global trends. Whatever the outcome may be for the city, this event clearly represents one of the biggest managerial failures in the history of the United States. Of course, during the recession of 2007 and 2008, many large corporations experienced failure due in part to poor management. Never before, though, has a managerial failure led to such a catastrophic situation.